on the calendar today. These come as a result of the deal to raise the debt limit. Lawmakers will take a break between 12:30 and 2:15 Eastern to attend their weekly party caucus meetings. And now, live Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. Almighty God, the center of our joy, guide our lawmakers through this day by your higher wisdom. Give them the clarity of thinking needed to solve the complex problems of our time. As they depend on your words and guidance, give them peace that comes from knowing they are instruments of your glory. Lord, help them never to be silent in the presence of injustice or impurity. Replace fear with faith, falsehood with truth, and greed with justice. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 13, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jean Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 2 hours. The Republicans will control the first half, and the majority will control the final half. Following morning business, the Senate will be in consideration of S.J.Res.10 and S.J.Res.24, both resolutions regarding balanced budget amendments. The Republican leader and I yesterday arrived at an agreement that we would have 8 hours of debate on this matter, and I think it should be a good debate. People have been looking forward to this debate for some time. Some are more interested than others, and this should give them ample time to say whatever they feel about this issue that's ripe for debate here in the Senate and certainly votes we'll have tomorrow morning. The Senate will recess this afternoon from 12:30 to 2:15 for our weekly caucus meetings. Excuse me. H.R. 1633 is at the desk and is due for second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
H.R. 1633, an act to establish a temporary prohibition against revising any national ambient air quality standard and so forth, and for other purposes.
I would object to any further proceedings on this matter, Madam President, at this time.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar under Rule 14.
In the last month, Republican leaders have repeated this mantra over and over. We support a payroll tax cut for working families. But, Madam President, we haven't seen any proof of this yet. It's only been talk. Senate Republicans have twice voted down their own payroll tax proposal. And House Republicans were unable to bring their plan to vote for weeks. We understand they're going to have a run at that tonight. Madam President, I've served in the House of Representatives. And when I served in the House of Representatives, no one would ever consider pushing something through with the majority of the majority. When I served there, Bob Michael was the Republican leader, Tip O'Neill was the Speaker, Jim Wright was the Majority Leader and the Speaker, and they always worked together on a bipartisan basis to get legislation passed. It's only a new thing that now the Republicans are saying that we're not going to pass anything unless we can do it on our own. That's unfortunate. Madam President, I spoke to the Speaker yesterday. I have the highest regard for him. I consider him a friend. But I said to him as serious as I could, we're not going to finish the work for our country this year unless we work together. You can't pass anything in the House unless you get Democratic votes, because anything you pass with strictly Republican votes fails over here. And over here, we can't pass anything unless we get Republican votes. It's a fact of life. We have issues, Madam President, we have to complete this year. So we have to understand, as I explained to the Speaker yesterday, we're going to have to do this together. We can't magically say the 53 Democrats are going to pass something here. And in the House, even though the Republicans have a majority, they know that we have a bicameral legislature and they have to get something passed over here also. So I'm very disappointed in what the Speaker has done to get a vote over there that he thinks will pass. He keeps adding ideological candy to the proposal. Last week they were supposed to have a vote. At this time they couldn't get the Republican votes to do it. I suggested that they go to either the former Speaker Nancy Pelosi or Steny Hoyer, the minority leader over there. I don't know the exact name of his, but the two leaders, Pelosi and Hoyer, and that was suggestion was turned down. This ideological candy that they've added to this bill to get rebellious rank-and-file Republicans on board is not going to sell over here. They recently added a provision to fast-track the controversial pipeline proposal attractive to the Tea Party, which, Madam President, is not opposed by President Obama. It's not opposed by him. He's saying that this is such a big deal that, for example, the state of Nebraska feels that unless there's some major changes made, it would badly damage that most important aquifer we have in that part of the country. In fact, probably the biggest and most important one we have any place in the country. So, Madam President, as was announced yesterday by the Secretary of State, she said if the Republicans are trying to push this on me, I can't make a decision in three months. That's what the legislation calls for. And if they do that, I will have to turn it down. Secretary of State has said that in writing. In effect, as some have said, what they're trying to do is kill the hostage. The hostage is the Keystone Pipeline, and if they push this through, it is bound and doomed to failure. But to tell everyone where they're coming from, they, the Republicans, Jim Jordan, who's a Republican congressman, said about the Keystone Pipeline, quote, frankly, the fact that presidents like it makes me like it even more. I repeat, the president has not said, Madam President, that he doesn't like it. But as a result of what has happened in Nebraska and other places along that pipeline, there's some major studies that need to go forward. President Obama and the Democrats in the Senate have already declared the House legislation dead on arrival. Yet after weeks of delay, Republicans are going to vote on it tonight. They're really wasting time catering to the Tea Party folks over there when they should be working with us on a bipartisan package that can pass both houses. We've offered solutions, serious good faith proposals with bipartisan support. If Republicans continue to block these reasonable plans to cut taxes for 160 million workers, there will of course be consequences. Middle-class Americans will notice when they open their paychecks in January and have less money to spend, and they'll have the Republican Congress to blame, no one else. Madam President, also for the third time in 2 weeks, Senate Republicans have filibustered a qualified nominee, one of the President's nominees. Last night they blocked confirmation of Marie Aponte to serve as ambassador to El Salvador, a job she already has. She's done it well for 15 months. She's finalized an important international anti-crime agreement with the people of El Salvador, forged a strong partnership with El Salvador in many different areas during her time as ambassador. I hope that the Republicans will come to their senses before her term expires at the beginning of the year and approve this good woman. I had a Republican senator come to me after the vote and said he believed that Republicans wanted to vote for her, and he was glad that I moved to reconsider the vote. I hope that, in fact, is the case. Last week, Republicans blocked the nomination of Richard Cordray to serve as head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Consumer Financial Protection Bill. Mr. Cordray has a record of protecting consumers from predatory lenders. 2 days before that, Republicans blocked the nomination of Caitlin Halligan on the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She's an exceptionally well-qualified person with a great resume, exceptional legal mind. She was blocked. All 3 nominees were qualified. All 3 had bipartisan support. All 3 were committed, enthusiastic public servants. Yet Republicans opposed their nominations for one purely partisan reason: to deal a blow to President Obama. This kind of Republican obstructionism has unfortunately become very commonplace, but it also has consequences. And Republicans aiming to hurt the President have once again harmed our country instead.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Today, the House of Representatives will vote on a bill that extends the temporary payroll tax cut as well as unemployment insurance, and which won't add a dime to the federal deficit. In other words, the House bill would do both of the things the President and Senate Democrats have described as their top legislative priorities before the close of this year. So it was surprising, to say the least, to read this morning that President Obama and my friend the Majority Leader are now plotting to block this very legislation, even to the point of forcing a government shutdown over the inclusion of a job-creating measure that the President thinks will complicate his re-election chances next year. That's what's happening in Washington this week, and the American people need to know about it. So let me repeat what's unfolding right now here in the Capitol. Yesterday, the members of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, agreed to a spending bill that would fund the government through the end of the fiscal year. That's next September 30th. And today, Republicans in the House will consider a bill that contains the President's top priorities: an extension of the payroll tax cut and unemployment insurance. But here's the problem. The House bill also includes a provision to accelerate construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, a project that's been described as the biggest shovel-ready project in America. And evidently, the President doesn't want this project approved before his election next November, because a small faction of very liberal voters he's counting on to help him get reelected don't like the pipeline. Now, we've already had 3 years of environmental studies. This project was not only ready to go from an environmental point of view, it's shovel-ready, will produce jobs almost immediately as soon as the President signs off on it. Here's a project that would create tens of thousands of jobs, as I indicated, right away. Also, wouldn't cost the taxpayers a dime to build. It's being built by the private sector. Would reduce the share of energy that we import from unfriendly countries overseas, and which everybody from labor unions to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says they support, because it would create tens of thousands of jobs right away. The Teamsters support getting the pipeline started right now. The AFL-CIO supports getting the pipeline started right now. This is the kind of project the Democrats themselves, including the President, have been saying all year that they want. But the presidential campaign seems to be getting in the way, to the point that my friend the Majority Leader now says he's willing to hold up a bipartisan bill to fund our troops, border security, and other federal responsibilities, rather than letting the President decide if this pipeline project should move forward. Let me say that again. The President and the Democratic Majority Leader, my friend Harry Reid, are now saying they'd rather shut down the government than allow this job-creating legislation to become law. That's what would happen if they succeed in blocking this bipartisan funding bill from coming to the floor for a vote. House Republicans are giving the President everything he asked for today. They just think that instead of simply producing more relief to those who continue to struggle in the economy, that we should also help prevent future job loss and incentivize the creation of new private sector jobs all at the same time. That's what the House bill does. It goes beyond government benefits, and takes us a step toward addressing the jobs crisis at hand. Most people would view this proposal as evidence that the two parties are putting their best ideas on the table and addressing both sides of this jobs crisis, the relief side and the incentive side. Most people would call it a balanced approach. Unfortunately, the President doesn't seem to be happy these days unless he's got an issue to divide us over. If the Republicans are proposing it, he's against it, regardless of how many job losses it prevents or how many private sector jobs it would help create, and he's not even trying to hide it. The Majority Leader signaled yesterday that he and the President are so determined to turn even the most bipartisan job-creating legislation into a political issue that he'll ask his members to hold off signing the government funding legislation they've already agreed to on a bipartisan basis, just to hand the President what they view as a political victory this week. This isn't just irresponsible, it's reckless. The House is about to pass a bill we believe, certainly going to consider today, that would help working Americans by extending the temporary payroll tax cut, help unemployed Americans by extending unemployment insurance, and which would help Americans looking for work by accelerating construction of the single biggest shovel-ready project in America. This is the biggest construction project in America, ready to go. It only needs a sign-off from the President of the United States. It deserves to pass with broad bipartisan support. They had a vote on that earlier this year in the House. 47 House Democrats voted to get this project started. So I would suggest that our friends put the political games aside and give the American people the certainty and the jobs that they deserve. Take up the House bill, pass it right here in the Senate, and send it to the President for a signature without theatrics and without delay. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 2 hours, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Madam President,
Senator from Maine.
I ask unanimous consent to be recognized for 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. This morning I rise to speak to the questions that the United States Senate will be focused on over the next day or so regarding a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Madam President, I don't think there's any doubt that we have to reverse this fiscal recklessness, not just for our time, but for all time. I have consistently and vehemently challenged a balanced budget amendment for the past 3 decades in both the House and the Senate to prevent precisely the kind of fiscal quagmire we are enmeshed in today as our federal government's borrowing an astonishing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. In my 30 years in the United States Congress, I have co-sponsored a balanced budget amendment 18 times, have spoken to it, have made statements in favor of 35 times. So I've had some experience in this battle to get the federal government to balance revenues with expenditures. And I learned that without a self-restraining mechanism, the debt over time only goes in one direction. In fact, we have debated in the United States Senate since 1981 on 5 different occasions a constitutional amendment. In the U.S. House of Representatives, it's been debated 4 times since 1981 through 1997. And we've seen what's happened with the mounting debt. So the impending vote to amend the Constitution represents an unambiguous choice between changing business as usual in Washington or embracing the status quo that we can no longer afford, that has brought this country to the edge of our fiscal chasm. The status quo that has led to more than 3 years without passing a federal budget, the status quo that has brought us the first ever downgrade of America's sterling AAA credit rating, the status quo that was exemplified by the Supercommittee's inability to agree on $1.2 trillion in debt reduction over the next 10 years. Now we have two competing balanced budget proposals pending before the Senate in somewhat of a partisan duel that has become regrettably all too predictable in Washington. Here, our nation is on the edge of a fiscal cliff. And as I said, the recent first ever downgrade of our credit rating. 20 million Americans unemployed or underemployed. There should not be two competing proposals on an issue as critical as our nation's fiscal health and survival. Why are we presented the idea of balancing the budget within the Constitution on the 87th day of our legislative schedule this year? And yet, here we are on the 347th day of the calendar year. 87 days we've been in legislative session, and yet we can only consign about 8 hours or so to the idea on debating the mighty question of a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Prior consideration in the United States Senate, whether it was in 1982, it was 11 days, in 1986 it was 8 days, 1995 was more than a month, 1997 it was another virtual month. And here we are giving 8 hours to debate two competing proposals rather than working through the differences through the amendment process, airing one another's legitimate differences so that we could ultimately resolve the question once and for all whether or not we should have a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Amending is consistent with the traditions and practices of the United States Senate. Yet, regrettably, we will be denied that opportunity, which is unprecedented, frankly, on this question. It's a question that clearly deserves much greater deference than is being accorded here in the United States Senate. Thomas Jefferson once wrote, "I place economy among the first and most important Republican virtues," and yes, that's Republican with a small r. And he went on to say, "public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared." He wrote in 1798, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I mean an additional article taking from the federal government the power of borrowing." Well, he understood. He understood the perils of borrowing. And we're not even going as far as Thomas Jefferson was advocating. But he also recognized the danger of debts and deficits do matter. He said one generation should not pay for the debts of another no more than we should pay the debts of a foreign nation. He couldn't have been more right. We have now entered what some economists have labeled an economic danger zone because our gross national debt is approaching 100% of gross domestic product. Our outstanding federal debt exceeds the entire size of America's economy. There's no question it's stunted economic growth, costing millions of American jobs at a time when we are experiencing the longest period of long-term unemployment and the worst post-recession recovery in the history of this country, the second worst recession in 100 years. Just as disturbingly, the government currently pays $200 billion annually in interest to foreign countries, that hold our treasury bonds, countries like China and Russia. And as it illustrated in this chart, the cost of the net increase alone in interest will more than triple in the next 10 years by the year 2021. That is just the net interest that we will pay. to foreign countries because of our bonded indebtedness. In fact, the CBO's most recent long-term outlook states that by 2035, interest costs on our nation's debt will reach 9% of the gross domestic product, more than the U.S. currently spends on Social Security or Medicare. And that's what, CBO has been addressing. Warned that growing debt would increase the probability of a sudden fiscal crisis during which investors would lose confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget, and government would thereby lose its ability to borrow at affordable rates, which is exactly what's happening in Europe. It could happen at any moment in time. It could be a small item that ultimately precipitates and triggers a debt crisis that puts this economy in jeopardy and peril as we experienced so traumatically in America in 2008. We do not know what could ignite this explosive growth in debt. If interest rates were just 1 percentage point higher per year over the next decade, the deficit will balloon by $1.3 trillion from increased costs. To put these numbers in perspective, you have to look at the past. Our nation accumulated in the first 200 years its first $1 trillion debt in 200 years. Yet in just the past 3 years alone, the national debt has soared by nearly $5 trillion. Let's just repeat that for a moment. The first 200 years, we accumulated $1 trillion in debt. The last 3 years, we have accumulated $5 trillion. So when the President stated last summer we don't need a constitutional amendment to do our jobs, well, not exactly. I mean, if that were true, Madam President, if such an amendment isn't required for us to do our jobs, then why do we find ourselves wallowing in this economic morass? If Congress actually possessed the capacity to forestall skyrocketing debt of its own volition, why are we mired in a major debt crisis? Why is the CBO and so many other forecasters reiterating and underscoring the negative outlooks for the future if we don't grapple with this debt? The facts speak for themselves. In 1986, when the Senate failed by 1 vote to pass a balanced budget amendment, the national debt topped $2.1 trillion. In 1995, we lost it again, and the national debt at that time was $4.8 trillion. In 1997, the Senate again lost it by 1 vote. Passed a balanced budget amendment. The national debt was $5.3 trillion, a number we found staggering, but apparently it wasn't staggering enough, as the abysmal track record following the 1997 dramatically demonstrates. Because in 1999, just 2 years after that fateful vote, the debt rose to $5.6 trillion. By 2009, it rose to $11 trillion. And last year to $13.5 trillion. And now today it is at $15 trillion. The bottom line is that from 1997 to 2011, the national debt has almost tripled. You know, in 1992, when I was serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, we debated a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, one of several times, and I argued for a balanced budget amendment on the floor. And during the debate, I said, we have no way of knowing how bad things might get if we continue without a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. We can only speculate, Madam President, where we would be had we passed that balanced budget amendment some 14 years ago. But we can no longer afford to speculate about where we will be with respect to our debt 14 years from now. Let us not be confused as we hear all the usual diversionary excuses why this amendment shouldn't pass. I have heard it time and time again over the last 3 decades, as I've indicated, and those excuses have been reiterated time and again, and the 9 times it's been considered between the House and Senate over the last 3 decades. How a balanced budget amendment will be overly restrictive, spending reductions too substantial, and that other measures will be equally effective without changing our Constitution. Well, let us not be distracted by the siren's call with this masterful art of deflection. As I recall at the time, during the course of that debate in 1992 in the U.S. House of Representatives, and I was giving my statement, and I was challenged by a colleague when he asked, what if appropriations exceeded estimated revenues? What if the President and Congress underestimated the amount of federal revenues in a fiscal year? What if it requires budgetary adjustments as a result of a contracting economy or inaccurate estimates? Well, as I said at the time, as I do now, welcome to the real world. What are families and businesses doing every day, trying to project their costs, their current costs, their future costs, whether or not they'll have a job, how much they'll get paid, what their health insurance is going to be? Or businesses knowing what their future health costs are going to be. The cost of living goes up for individuals, for businesses, and on it goes. That's the real world. But it's not one in which we live here in the Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, and one that we have long ignored, to our fiscal peril. Not to mention 49 states that have adopted balanced budget requirements. These are issues that day in and day out that state capitals have to deal with. As the presiding chair had known, being a former governor of the state of New Hampshire, they had to make choices. My husband was a former governor of Maine. You have to make choices in tough times. That means you have to establish priorities. You have to understand what's coming in and what's going out. And you've got to balance them. Well, why should the federal government be any different? Because obviously it hasn't worked, you know, on our own devices. It hasn't worked through any other means. So now we have a fiscal gap here in Washington that not only is a disparity between our revenues and expenditures, but it's also a shameful imbalance between the trust the American people have placed in us as elected officials and the responsibilities that we must carry out if we are to demonstrate the worthiness of that trust. Madam President, absent a permanent mechanism that compels and forces the Congress to set and fulfill its fiscal priorities, we will continue blithely in our wayward practices, obviously. We only have to learn from the past to understand the future. And rest assured that we have tried every statutory structure possible, yet nothing we have implemented has withstood the test of time, circumvention, and gimmickry. We did have some positive effects of statutory limits with budget enforcement mechanisms such as Graham-Rubin-Hollings, the Budget Enforcement Act, the Statutory Balanced Budget Act of 1997. But unfortunately, we allowed them to lapse because we could do it statutorily. You couldn't do it with a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment would not allow these efforts to wither on the vine, and it would bind Congress to Congress. So when we talk about a debt reduction package for the future, no matter what we do today could be undone tomorrow by the next Congress if we do not have the binding effects of a constitutional amendment. That is the big difference. That's what Congress knows. They do not want their hands tied. That's what this is all about, Madam President. Not to tie our hands to make all the decisions we want, irrespective of the impact on the mounting debt. We have squandered historic opportunities. I tried for the legislative trigger back in 2001 when we had projected surpluses to pay down the national debt, invest in Social Security and Medicare, but it was dismissed and derided. Senator Bayh and I tried to get that through, but people weren't thinking about the future. I had just learned from the past. I had seen from experience I knew that we had to take those surpluses and protect them and invest in the future, but unfortunately that didn't happen. People want to spend without restraint. Well, as we sadly know, the promises were empty about getting a handle on our budget. That's why we haven't had budgets in the last 3 years. That's why we haven't passed appropriations, one appropriations last year for the first time since 1974, since the Budget Act. This is all correlated. It's all a cause and effect. Because if you have no discipline in the budget process, you have no discipline in spending and the mounting debt. That's the net effect of what's happened over the last 3 decades. So the reality could not be more stark about the necessity for a balanced budget amendment, and yes, we do need one, if we're ever to ensure the perpetuity of fiscal balance and restraint. And finally, Madam President, let me just say, and I know even Vice President Biden spoke to this issue, sort of expressing the same frustrations I do today. In 1995 debate here in the United States Senate, which I was a part, he said there's nothing left to try except the balanced budget amendment. Exactly. That's where we are. And I don't understand why we are in a position here today where we have 2 competing amendments. It's not as if we don't have differences, certainly. Why not have one amendment? Why not amend it? That's what the United States Senate's all about. But it's become an all or nothing proposition. It's a zero-sum game. It's either your way or no way. Well, that's regrettable. It's another cynical process set up here in the Senate. So we have 2 separate votes on 2 separate measures, creating a parallel universe with 2 different balanced budget amendments, but 0 opportunity to reconcile our differences. We know what the strategy is. It's called lip service. It's to allow everyone to say they voted for a balanced budget amendment, while the armies of the status quo employ every weapon to ensure that it doesn't happen. I regret that we're not treating this issue, as I said earlier, with the deference that it deserves, an issue that 70–80% of the American people support, at a time in which the United States Congress has an approval rating of 9 or 12%. It varies from day to day. I say that we should be collectively embarrassed about how this reflects on the institution, because we're not focusing on the issues that matter to people in their daily lives. And this matters because they understand that we are shackling future generations. The choice couldn't be more clear. We can either bring disrepute upon ourselves by continuing to mortgage our future to cover the fiscal offenses of today, or we can rise to the occasion, Madam President, and meet our moral responsibility and bequeath the generations to come a nation unencumbered by the shackles of perpetual debt. The decision is ours, and history awaits our answer. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Senator from Texas.
Madam President, may I inquire of the Chair how much time is remaining on our side for morning business?
39.5 minutes.
Madam President, I'm sure I won't need all that time, but I'd ask unanimous consent to speak for that remaining period of time, or at least so much as I may use of that 39 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I want to express my appreciation to the Senator from Maine for her leadership on the balanced budget amendment issue for so long now. This is a fight that people have fought for so long that some have become very cynical about whether or not we actually will ever act in a responsible fashion to deal with the runaway debt that our country continues to accrue, with about 40 cents out of every dollar being spent today continues to be spent of borrowed money. And we know that this is not just a theoretical problem. This is very real. When we look at what's happening in Europe with countries engaged in sovereign debt crises that have made promises that they can't afford to keep. And the day of reckoning has come to Europe. And the day of reckoning for the United States may not be far behind. But I think it's really important to lay a few foundational points. Let me start with the preface of the Constitution of the United States of America, because what we're talking about doing is amending the Constitution something we've only done 27 times since the founding of our country. But the Constitution of the United States starts this way. It says, "We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So this Constitution, it's important to recognize, Madam President, this is a Constitution created by the American people. This is not something handed down from on high that we cannot change or should not change. This is our Constitution. We own it. And it's within our power to amend the Constitution when circumstances make it prudent for us to do so. Let me also refer to Article 5 of the United States Constitution. This is the basis upon which we are seeking to amend the Constitution by this vote tomorrow. Article 5 says the Congress, when two-thirds of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution. And then, should the joint resolution pass with two-thirds of vote in both houses, then it goes to the states, where 38 states, three-quarters of the states would have to ratify that amendment before it become the fundamental law of the land. There is another provision in Article 5 that I'll talk about in a minute, which allows the states, in the face of inaction by Congress, to ask for a constitutional convention to be established for that purpose. But as I said, I will save that for a later time. Madam President, all 47 members on this side have co-sponsored Senate Joint Resolution number 10. But this does not have to be a partisan endeavor. Indeed, the last time, in 1997, when there was a vote on a constitutional amendment and it failed by one vote in the Senate, 11 Democrats joined Republicans to come within one vote of passing that joint resolution, which had already passed the House of Representatives. So this does not have to be, and indeed should not be, a partisan undertaking. But let me just remind my colleagues, what did our financial situation look like in 1997? Well, our deficit was $107 billion. That's right, $107 billion. Today, it's roughly $1.3 trillion. 107 billion in 97, today $1.3 trillion. Our national debt, which recently broke the $15 trillion mark, back then it was roughly $5 trillion. So we've seen almost a threefold increase in our national debt since 1997, when we came within one vote of passing a constitutional amendment and sending it to the states. Well, we know that throughout American history, our government has faced fiscal challenges. Our founders had their own when they had to amend the Articles of Confederation to provide for a Constitution that allowed us to deal with our financial problems. But what are the differences between those faced by the founding generation and those we face today? Back then, government was the solution to the problem, and today the size and growth of government is the problem. And the American people understand the difference clearly. As I said, the American people are absolutely repulsed by the idea that Congress continues to spend 40 cents out of every dollar that it spends in borrowed money. You know, I know people like to say, well, this is a problem for the next generation and beyond. But all you have to do is look across the Atlantic Ocean to what's happening in Europe today, and you realize, no, this is our problem, this generation, now, in Europe, and the ramifications could easily extend to the United States and create a recession, if not worse, here in the United States as we go through a sovereign debt crisis. The American people also understand that this huge debt that we bear is a job killer, because what it does is it dampens economic growth. And only by the private sector economy growing do you get the sort of job creation that will help get us out of this mess. And right now we're muddling along at roughly 2% of GDP, which is not even enough to deal with the unacceptably high unemployment. Yes, we had a break last week when we saw the unemployment rate come down a little bit, but a closer look at the statistics reveal that it was because so many people quit looking for a job. They gave up. Well, we also know that this is a national security risk, this high debt. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, said the debt was the single largest threat to our national security. This is the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You wouldn't think that that was part of his portfolio, but that's what keeps him awake at night and worries him, our debt, and the fact that China is the major purchaser of that debt, someone whose interests are not exactly aligned with ours, to say the least. And Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said that the debt undermines our capacity to act in our own interest and sends a message of weakness internationally. And then there's a quote from a former colleague of ours, Madam President, way back in 2006, who said, quote, "Increasingly, America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally." He said it's a sign that we now depend on ongoing financial assistance from foreign countries to finance our government's reckless fiscal policies. Close quote. And you may have guessed it, yes, that was then Senator Barack Obama. What I think people find absolutely unnerving, disappointing, and yes, even shocking is the lack of leadership on this issue. Not only because our national debt is a growing fiscal problem as well as a national security risk, it has created a crisis of confidence in our political system and people's confidence in the Congress's ability to do what we get paid for, what we got elected to do, and that is to solve our nation's problems, including our nation's fiscal problem. President Obama understands this very well. That's why he appointed a bipartisan fiscal commission, now called the Simpson-Bowles Commission, that came up with $4 trillion in debt reduction, along with other recommendations like tax reform, which would make us more competitive globally. But in 2010, in December 2010, when that report was rendered, what has the President done with regard to that report? It got bipartisan support. I believe it was 11 out of the 18 members, including 3 Republican senators at that time, Judd Gregg, Mike Crapo, and Tom Coburn. The President walked away from it. He walked away from it. What did he do when he gave his State of the Union speech shortly thereafter? He didn't even mention it. What did he do? Did he come up with a counter-proposal or a different proposal? No. He held back, waited till the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, and House Republicans passed the budget out of the House, something that has not happened in the Senate for more than 900 days. The President attacked. He engaged in scare tactics that really, I believe, are beneath the dignity and responsibility of the office of President of the United States. Well, leadership on the national debt has not only been lacking from the White House, Congress hasn't done much better. And it's true, as the senator from Maine has said, that the basic conundrum we have in times when we pass deficit reduction legislation like Graham-Rudman-Hollings and the other is that purely statutory fixes are fine, but they can't bind future Congresses. We need a constitutional amendment that will make it the law of the land that cannot be ignored by future Congresses when we do, as I hope we will do, embrace our responsibility to pass this constitutional amendment. Well, the facts show that that show that the time for a strong, balanced budget amendment is now. It is today. Joint Resolution 10 is a strong, balanced budget amendment that will protect the American people from runaway deficits and reckless spending. If ratified by 3/4 of the states, that's 38 states, it would require a 2/3 supermajority of Congress in both chambers to approve a deficit in any fiscal year. A supermajority would be needed in a time of emergency to approve a deficit in any given year, and it can't be open-ended. It has to happen each year that a deficit might be run. And we can imagine that emergencies could occur, but it shouldn't be a routine matter as it is now where we engage in deficit spending. This amendment would provide exceptions that only when a majority of both chambers that it would require a majority of both chambers to approve a deficit during a time of declared war. And a 3/5 supermajority in both chambers could approve a deficit during military conflicts. So for those of our colleagues who are worried that this balanced budget amendment would provide such a straitjacket it would deny us the flexibility to respond to our nation's emergencies, in the amendment itself is provided the means to deal with those extraordinary circumstances. Joint Resolution 10 would also require a 2/3 majority to approve outlays beyond 18% of GDP. That's roughly what our revenue has been, roughly 18% of GDP, although today our spending's at 25%, and because of the recession and the fragile economic recovery, our income is roughly 15%, so we're running roughly a 10% annual deficit. This resolution, this amendment would require a 2/3 majority to raise taxes. We don't have a tax problem. We have a spending problem. And we are not able to keep up with the promises we made, both in terms of entitlement and other spending. And this would require the discipline of 2/3 supermajority to raise taxes in order to balance the budget. So we could do it when there was a broad consensus that that was necessary, but not provide the easy out to just raise taxes in order to balance the budget, unless 2/3 said that was all right. And then it would also provide a 3/5 supermajority to raise the debt limit. Finally, and this is important, Madam President, the balanced budget amendment, Senate Joint Resolution 10, would require the President to submit a balanced budget to the Congress each year. Now, the President has historically submitted a budget in, I believe, roughly February of each year, but it's rarely balanced. Indeed, the last budget submitted by President Obama was not even brought up for a vote by our friends across the aisle, and when we insisted upon a vote on that budget, it lost 97-0. No Democrat and no Republican voted for President Obama's last budget because it continued the reckless spending and the debt. It's important that this body support a strong, balanced budget amendment and not just a fig leaf or cover vote, because Senate Joint Resolution 10 has the strongest provisions on spending and taxes, in addition to provisions that would allow us to balance the budget. I know there's another alternative that will be voted on, but I'm afraid that this alternative offers more of a mirage than a real solution. First of all, it does not include all spending. This would make government accounting even more mystifying, even more opaque, less transparent. Can you imagine families and small businesses doing something like that, saying, well, we're going to balance our budget, but we're not going to include all the spending that we do? Small businesses and our families don't have the luxury of moving things off the balance sheet in sort of Enron-style accounting, and neither should their government. Either you balance the budget or you do not. The alternative that we will be presented an opportunity to vote on next to this strong, balanced budget amendment, this alternative does not protect the middle class from higher taxes. It would not have stopped the 21 tax increases that have been enacted in the first 3 years of the Obama administration. That's right, 21 tax increases during the first 3 years of this administration. The problem is not that with Washington is not that it is too difficult to raise taxes. The problem is it is too easy. A real solution to our debt crisis must permanently change the propensity to tax and spend with reckless disregard. A strong, balanced budget amendment will actually solve the problem. Let's remember that the disease here in Washington that the balanced budget amendment is designed to cure is out-of-control federal spending, and big deficits are just a symptom of that disease. Any doctor will tell you that just treating the symptom doesn't treat the disease, and without treating the underlying cause of those symptoms, we would not be making matters better. We would just be creating, again, another illusion of a solution. The strong, balanced budget amendment, which I support, along with 46 of my Republican colleagues, and I hope a significant showing on the other side, will treat the disease along with the symptoms. An amendment with too many exceptions and loopholes will not. A strong, balanced budget amendment will reassure financial markets and the American people that we understand the magnitude of the problem. As I talk to my constituents in Texas and around the country and others around the country who are the type of people that we're looking to create jobs by making the investments, by starting businesses and by growing existing businesses, they tell me that with the growing debt, with uncertainty about tax policy, with overregulation, and with the unwillingness to deal with a potential sovereign debt crisis and slow economic growth in the private sector, that they're just going to sit it out. They're sitting on the sidelines. They're not going to take imprudent risks with the capital they've acquired after going through this recession and becoming leaner and becoming more efficient. They're not ready to get back in the game until they get a signal from us that we're actually serious about solving our financial problems. Well, unfortunately, the President not only has neglected his own bipartisan fiscal commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and fallen for the siren call of his political advisors to don't offer a constructive solution, but rather just attack those who do. The President has compounded his mistake in this area by saying we don't need a constitutional amendment to do our jobs. Well, presumably that refers not only to our balanced budget amendment, but to an amendment offered by the Democrats as an alternative to the Senate Republican balanced budget amendment. The President claimed that a balanced budget amendment is not necessary because the Constitution already tells us to do our jobs and make sure the government is living within its means and making responsible choices. Who does he think he is fooling? Who does he think he's kidding? The President does himself no credit, and indeed, I think, demonstrates a lack of commitment to dealing with our nation's problems when he says things like that. He knows that the experience of this Congress has been, whether it's Republican administrations or Democratic administrations, that without a balanced budget amendment, we simply are not going to have the tools necessary to get the job done. According to one White House spokesman, balancing the budget is not complicated. Well, if it's not complicated, how come the President of the United States hasn't submitted a balanced budget proposal? His last one, because it broke the bank, made the debt worse, didn't solve the problem, was rejected 97-0 by a bipartisan vote in this body. This same spokesman said all that's needed is we put politics aside, quit ducking responsibility, roll up our sleeves, get to work, get beyond politics as usual. I have to say, Madam President, what bunk is that? Don't they know how little credibility that sort of rhetoric has when it comes to solving the problem? Just saying it does not make it so. What people are looking for is concrete action. The strange thing to me, Madam President, when the President of the United States invited Republican conference over to the executive office building several months back, he asked for ideas around the table, and several of us, including me, told him, Mr. President, if you would embrace solutions to solving these problems, we would work with you because we are Americans first and not members of political party first. We are Americans. We didn't come here just to posture and to act like we were solving the problem while doing nothing. We actually are willing to do it because, frankly, we're concerned, and many of us are beyond concerned. We're scared. And this is no longer just for our children and grandchildren. This is about the present generation. This is about us. And all we need to do is look at what's happening in Europe. And it could be our problem in the foreseeable future. And I'm not just talking about decades. I'm talking about years. And it could be earlier. Everything you read about the sovereign debt crisis in Europe and the history of these crises in the past is once the public loses confidence in the ability of a sovereign nation to pay its debt back, then things slip away very quickly. We've seen that happen in Europe with the price of the debt on Italian bonds and others, Greek bonds, go through the roof because people know they can't be paid back. And if people begin to doubt for a minute our lack of resolve at dealing with this fiscal crisis and this debt crisis, we could well be not just in a similar mess, we could be worse off because there will be no European Union, there will be no IMF to bail out the United States of America, the largest economy of the world. Madam President, let me just close for now by saying that this is not just a matter of conjecture whether a balanced budget amendment would help and would work. 49 different states have some form of balanced budget requirement. Vermont is the only one that does not. Of these, 32 states have constitutional provisions. Additional states require that their governor actually propose a balanced budget or require a balanced budget indirectly by prohibiting the state from carrying a deficit into the next year. But the point is, this is not just a matter of conjecture and guesswork. We know, because we've seen it happen at the state level, that a balanced budget requirements are effective. And what do? Well, we know that state balanced budget requirements are only effective when combined with limitations on taxing and spending. States with limitations on taxing and spending are less likely to raise taxes to balance the budget than states without such a limitation. States with tax and spending limitations have a slower growth of government than states without such limitations. In other words, states with tax and spending limitations have a slower rate of growth in the cost of government and the size of government than states without them. So we know that a balanced budget amendment can work. And I hope that my colleagues, as frustrated as I am on a bipartisan basis with the lack of leadership on this, will show leadership. We shouldn't just look for leadership over at the White House or anywhere else. We ought to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what can I do to solve this problem? And I submit that a balanced budget amendment would go a long way to putting us on the path to fiscal responsibility. Now, we can't do it overnight because we didn't get into this mess overnight. But just as Vice President Biden said back in 1995, I have concluded that there's nothing left except to try a balanced budget amendment. That's what Vice President Biden said in 1995. I agree with him. But if it was true then, it's even more true now. So I hope that tomorrow when we have a chance to vote, we will vote for a real solution, a real balanced budget amendment, Senate Joint Resolution 10, that will avoid the temptation to act once again like we're doing something without actually delivering a solution to the problem by providing a cover, a fig leaf, that once again will undermine the public's confidence in our commitment and our willingness and our leadership when it comes to the nation's problems. Ultimately, Madam President, the American people will have the final say on this. If we don't do it tomorrow, then the American people will have another chance to have an election and vote and presumably choose people who will deal with the problem. And ultimately, we know, getting back to Article 5 of the Constitution, that if Congress does not propose a solution, that, to quote Article 5, on the application of the legislatures of two-thirds of the several states, that there shall be called a constitutional convention for proposing amendments. So the final word is not with the members of Congress, although we can solve the problem tomorrow if we voted on it and we passed it and encourage our colleagues in the House to pass it. Ultimately, there will be an intervening election, but ultimately, beyond that, the Constitution, which is the Constitution of we, the people of the United States, the people of the United States will have the final word, whether it be in the next election in 2012 or by means of a constitutional convention called on the application of two-thirds of the states, of which I'm told about 20 applications are already pending. Madam President, I yield the floor and reserve the balance of my time.